Okay, let's talk about type 2 diabetes. I mean, almost every day when you open a newspaper, there's something about it now. People are getting more concerned because they're saying it's more of a lifestyle induced condition. People want to be more aware of, is there anything they can do to prevent against it? So let's just start with, what is type 2 diabetes?
It's a condition where you start to lose the ability to regulate your blood sugar levels, but it's different to type 1 diabetes in that it is it is a condition of resistance to insulin by your body's cells rather than type 1 being a lack of insulin production, so you haven't got the hormone that controls it. Whereas in type 2 diabetes, certainly in the early days, the feature of it is actually excess insulin levels, because what's happening is the blood sugar levels have gotten progressively higher due to lots of different reasons, and the insulin is having to get higher and higher each time in order for the cells to sort of listen to that signal, if you like, and let the glucose in. So glucose can't just flood into the cells of the body. It has to go through like a little gate. So insulin is the hormone that actually opens that gate for glucose to get into the cell. And then glucose can then be used as a fuel and make energy. Okay, so that's ultimately what the fate of glucose is. So in type 2 diabetes, you don't have the sensitivity of the cells to the insulin anymore. So the insulin is there and saying, hello, can the glucose come in? But then the cell's like, well, you've been here before, I've only just let you in. So it's almost like the excesses of the glucose and the insulin, the cells stop listening. So you need more and more insulin each time in order to get the same response.
So what are those symptoms that you'll start to feel? What are they?
So actually, for quite a lot of people, asymptomatic, so no symptoms, because it really happens very insidiously, really slowly, and it's more often diagnosed by a routine blood test than it is through somebody struggling with symptoms. But if people are symptomatic, it's symptoms of not being able to regulate your blood sugar. So if they miss a meal, they'd get very shaky, irritable, that kind of picture. They might be gaining weight. In fact, most people would be gaining weight, but because there's lots of different reasons for that, people might not think it could be connected to their blood sugar regulation initially. So they might think, oh, I haven't been getting a lot of exercise recently, or, my diet's not great.
But what is that that's making you gain the weight? The body is holding on to the fat because...
Yeah. So, when your glucose is getting higher and higher, and your insulin in response to that is also getting higher and higher, insulin, as well as putting the glucose into the cells, the other thing that it does is it's a fat storage hormone. So it actually tells your body to store fat. So the more insulin you need, the more weight you're going to gain.
So the correlation between larger people and diabetes goes much further than just poor diet.
Much further. It's a chemical thing. So it's associated with diet as well. So the last thing we do not want to get the message across that you can eat what you want. It's all hormonal, because it's not. But there's significant hormonal changes with the insulin, in that insulin in excess is quite damaging to the body. But one of the symptoms that then you can observe is that you gain a lot of weight, particularly around the middle region of your body. So it tends to we always look at things like waist hip ratios. So your waist is meant to be a narrower portion of your body than your hips are. So if your waist is significantly bigger than your hips, then there's often a blood sugar regulation issue. So that's something that you can actually look at, you can tangibly see, and that's often a picture of insulin resistance.
And obviously a large part of the Gutology project is, what is that connection between type 2 diabetes and the gut?
So it all comes down to what is living in the gut. So we'll talk about diet in a minute, but firstly, the microbiome, so the gut bacteria, they are producing short-chain fatty acids, things like butyrate, or these things are being absorbed then across the intestinal wall, and they have messaging properties. So they're telling then the body to do something. So the short-chain fats are there to actually increase the cell sensitivity to insulin and to glucose. So if you haven't got enough fibre in your diet and you're not feeding the good bugs, then you're not getting the short-chain fatty acids that are being produced. Therefore, you're starting to... the cells are becoming less sensitive to insulin.
So what's fascinating here is like, my sort of Luddite impression of diabetes is you eat too much bad foods, you put on a load of weight, everything starts working properly. But what we're actually saying is that the food you're eating shapes the microbiome.
Yeah.
And when the microbiome becomes out of whack, there is some kind of dysbiosis, or there's not enough of the good bacteria, then the whole process can't work properly.
Yeah. There's a drug called metformin that is a really common drug for people that have got diabetes because it helps to regulate the blood sugar, and it can have some really good results. But one of the things that has been observed in terms of its mechanism of action is it's altering the microbiome as it is passing through the GI tract. So it has other effects on the liver and on glucose storage and things like that are really well documented. But as it's being absorbed through the gut, because it's an oral medicine, it is changing the microbes in the gut as it does so. So now researchers are thinking, well, is it because that it's changing the microbiome that then the body is able to self-regulate and increase the sensitivity again? Or is it that it's only working in the mechanism we originally thought?
So when somebody comes into your clinic and they've been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, where do you start to begin? What journey can they go on? And do you have some examples of, people that you have treated and what has happened?
So we've got to look at quite a multitude of things, actually. It's not just a diet disorder. It's a hormonal one, but also it's an inflammatory one as well. So we have to look at the inflammation levels in the body. So if you were to measure a certain inflammatory markers in the blood, they can be higher in people with diabetes than those who don't have diabetes. Also, the presence of the tissue around the middle of the body, it's the fat tissue that the insulin has actually caused the development of an increased amount of. It produces chemicals, so it's actually making inflammatory molecules that then travel around the body and make the whole thing worse. So unfortunately, once the whole pathology of diabetes gets on its way, it's then self-fulfilling, because what initially might have caused the decreased sensitivity, you've now got a whole load of fat tissue there that's actually, it's metabolically active tissue in its own right, that's then releasing all of these inflammatory chemicals that then make the resistance to insulin from the cells even worse. So it has just like an exponential effect on how then the cells really can't tolerate, they can't accept the insulin and then the glucose.
So it starts with when in the clinic, when somebody comes to you, it's about firstly like regulating the dysbiosis, like sorting out the gut, and that can be done from diet, probiotics, removing things from the gut, getting an overall picture. And a lot of that is done by getting a gut test. Like, let's actually see what's going on inside. Are there any other tests? You were talking about inflammation, so biomarkers, those are blood tests.
So blood tests that you can get done. But, things that look for inflammatory markers is not what I would do, though, because the presence of having the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes is, okay, we know there's going to be elevations of certain cytokines in the body. So it's not something that I then, let's go looking for them. My philosophy is always look for something that then you can tangibly use in order to get that person better. So we know there's going to be high levels of inflammation. There's no need to get a test on that particularly. The issue with type 2 diabetes is it increases the risk of cardiovascular disease really significantly, because it contributes to a level of inflammation that is really insidious. It's not the sort of inflammation that's giving you a fever and it's not making your skin red or anything like that. It's silent. And this is really a contributor to heart disease and strokes and things like that. So the presence of excess sugar in the bloodstream accelerates the production of plaques inside your arteries and can really narrow the spaces that the blood has to go through. So the natural response for that is your blood pressure then rises to go through. So quite often I'm monitoring people's blood pressure at the same time as looking after their diabetes, because it's all the same sort of picture. So it's if I was to do any tests on anybody with type 2 diabetes, it would be looking more at something we call organic acids testing, which actually looks at mitochondrial function and see how effectively they're using all the fuels in their body. So you can see about glucose and fats and proteins and how they're using them, and actually enhancing that, so that when we're addressing the sensitivity through nutritional means, but then once the glucose gets into the cell, can we make the most of that? And so looking from that sort of chemical perspective of what's going on as well.
And then, so as far as those results, it really then goes into a diet change.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what sort of advice are you giving out, and what are the results of that?
Yeah, so a low glycemic load diet is a really good place to start for diabetics. And what that means is it's just enabling any carbohydrate in the diet to be released much more slowly into the bloodstream. So the philosophy is trying to reduce the amount of times the blood glucose level will spike. So we just want it to be kept on quite an even keel in quite narrow parameters, really, because any spikes in glucose are going to cause a subsequent spike in insulin, and then the whole thing just gets worse.
So from what I understand, it's an obvious thing. You reduce sugars in the diet. That's like, I think anybody can kind of, even somebody that doesn't know much about nutrition can go, okay, I know I need to reduce sugars. But also, I think, there is a misunderstanding there about carbohydrates actually being a sugar. And that can have an impact. So are you telling people to reduce their amount of carbohydrate intake as well?
You've got to be really careful with it, because there's a lot of misconception here, because carbohydrates provide you with your whole grains, don't they? If we take away all the whole grains, you're going to start affecting the microbiome in possibly an adverse way and potentiate the condition even more. So it's not as simple as the grams of carbohydrate your intake is, and then how that is looking at your blood sugar. That's more, I would consider, day-to-day management of it. So I don't want people to be having cakes and biscuits and really, really sweet foods. And if they were to add sugar to their tea or coffee, I would advise that they didn't do that, because it's spiking the blood sugar. But to have like whole grains and lots of vegetables, things like carrots, some people say, well, carrots have got a lot of sugar in them. Okay, so it's a starchy root vegetable, yes, potentially, but the pigment in carrots really helps feed some of your gut bacteria. So we don't want to just eliminate things because they are carbohydrate, and actually all foods eventually break down to sugars anyway. So
sort of, I know it's a broad brushstroke, but a general sort of diet that people that are in your clinic, you migrate them onto, what does that look like?
Okay, so I use a diet that actually helps to deal with the glycemic load of food. So if they are having carbohydrate, combining it with a protein, so that really slows the release of the sugars down. I also use a diet sort of within the same setup is really high in phytonutrients, so lots of different colours, lots of different types of vegetables. And the diet that I use is very cardioprotective as well. So it's using the knowledge that type 2 diabetes as a metabolic situation is a significant risk factor for development of ongoing cardiovascular disease. So I'm trying to prevent that happening at the same time, but treating that with quite a degree of seriousness.
And what are the results of when you see people go from what you would maybe deem as a poor diet onto this diet? What do you see happen?
So you can see reversal of type 2 diabetes, which is completely, it's something that if you take without medication, if you take the right steps, you can reverse type 2 diabetes. So one of the best ways to measure it is by blood test, which the GP can do, or you can do privately, and it's a value called HbA1c. And what that tells you is the amount of sugar that's been in your bloodstream over a period of about 3 to 4 months, because it's measuring the hemoglobin and how much sugar is stuck to the hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is a portion of your red blood cells, and they survive about 3 or 4 months in your bloodstream. So by measuring that, it's far, far more accurate than just by taking a snapshot of what your sugar level is at that moment in time. So HbA1c is used as a diagnostic marker for type 2 diabetes, and you can be called pre-diabetic if it's creeping into that range, or full diagnosis of diabetic. So what I see is a lot of movement, and I measure it with HbA1c too, so that if somebody's type 2 diabetic and then we follow a program 6 months later, they can very frequently be then non-diabetic, not even just pre-diabetic, but non-diabetic in a safer zone.
So what we're saying is not only is diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and type 1 to an extent connected to the gut, by changing your diet, you can not only remove yourself from medication, but in some cases it is reversible.
Yes, it is reversible. It's what I've seen many times.